Hey everybody, my name is Alex Merced, and welcome to my two-part video on, or the second part of my two-part video on criminal justice reform. So in the first video, we kind of talked about judicial immunity, prosecutorial immunity, about the nature of just creating more laws that create criminals by definition, and a lot of aspects of sort of the way the system carries out in just rendering a judgment. But that's the middle part, okay? When you think about this, there's really three parts. There's the enforcement. This is the part where basically you did something, or theoretically did something wrong, and enforcement, the cops come, arrest you, put you through the process. Then there's the middle part. The judges and the district attorneys and the prosecutors, they kind of determine whether to convict you or not. And then there's the punishment side, okay, the incarceration, the jails, and whatnot. So I want to focus more on the bread of the sandwich in this video. So again, a lot of people talk about cops over the last several years because, so while we've talked about, police reform a lot, it oftentimes just comes down to sort of the periphery of what the police officers are doing. So whether it's body cams, de-escalation training. So while body cams are great, allows you to have more evidence to figure out what happened, to figure out, who's in the right, who's in the wrong. That's wonderful. De-escalation training, of course, great because it can allow situations to not escalate. But that only does so much. You're not addressing necessarily sort of the fundamental issues, because again, you have the same sort of dynamic that you do on the criminal justice side in the middle, where basically people score, and it's not necessarily the cops' fault. It's what we expect out of the criminal justice system. The fact that we sort of expect punishment, that we expect sort of zero tolerance, it creates this culture where basically you score points by, arrest. And this is not every cop. I know a lot of cops who don't, or who their precinct doesn't have this kind of culture. It's more like in some places and in some ways it's rewarding to be more harsh than others. And it's not because you're necessarily harsher, but because just the nature of the job and sort of the way you climb the ranks is by solving more crimes or solving more cases and closing more cases. So you're constantly looking for how to close a case. In a case where maybe a case should stay open or shouldn't or doesn't need to be resolved, that doesn't necessarily enhance your career. So it's just sort of this aspect of like what do we reward? How do we see sort of good results? And it's similar to what we see in education. The question is, what should good results look like? And are we asking for the wrong results, causing a culture that may not be getting the right results? Okay, because that's a deeper issue. And then also just the deeper issue of what we call crime. Again, more crimes, more criminals. You overstretch your resources. You create hostility where it doesn't necessarily need to be. Because generally what happens is prohibition, in particular, whenever you create sort of something illegal that gets pushed into that good or service gets pushed into black markets, which gets pushed into organized crime. Organized crime pays well, but is also very dangerous. So you end up recruiting people into that enterprise, that people who who are willing to take the risk for the reward, and that's often going to be people who are in not so well off neighborhoods and communities. So it adversely affects the poor in general. Why? Because things are already tough, so the additional risk isn't, basically when you're in a situation where you're already choosing between starving and robbing the local store in order to find some food, going to drug dealing doesn't seem as risky for the reward you're getting, in a sense. So you end up creating sort of these criminal organizations that get empowered because they're making the profits off the prohibition profit, because something becomes more expensive when you have to get it illegally, and it's the illegal crime syndicate that's sort of making that profit. But at the same time, it makes it harder for it creates sort of an intergenerational sort of stuck in poverty-ness. And I know that's not a term, but that's essentially what happens, because you're creating this sort of cycle of recruitment for this organized crime. You're creating violence in those neighborhoods, and you just create this sort of situation where you get stuck. And this is a poor neighborhood thing. It becomes racial because, for a variety of historical reasons, you have a disproportionate demographics. When you take a look at demographics across socioeconomic levels, you're going to see a much higher representation of minorities at lower socioeconomic levels, mainly because you've had less generations of wealth transfers that have occurred, allowing for there to be sort of, well, just basically causing the result that you see. But doesn't necessarily mean that's always going to be true. But the dynamic of basically the poor neighborhoods being where you recruit your criminal labor force from is going to be a prevalent dynamic because of just the nature of incentives, and that's why you don't want to necessarily create crimes out of things you don't need to create crimes out of, because one, you only have so many cops to go around. You kind of rather have them kind of stopping murderers and rapists, and you don't want to create more of that by accident because you empower criminal syndicates by giving them new profit centers. And that also, again, creates a division in some of these neighborhoods where there is sort of no longer this sort of community with enforcement feeling, where it's this sort of more antagonistic feeling, and that allows situations to sort of escalate. So there's that. But then again, on the other side, when you go to jail, well, where it's just harsh punishment, whether it's a private or a public prison. When people talk about private prisons all the time, it's not like public prisons are a walk in the park. Because we design our system of incarceration based on punishment. Okay, even when it's done for profit, they may. And again, when it's done for profit, when you have private prisons, while there's been really horrible abuses under the current regime of private prisons across the country, I want people to just combine sort of the idea that it's private with the idea that all these abuses must happen if it's private. It depends on how you pay people. At the end of the day, incentives matter. I mean, this is something that's kind of happening in the healthcare field. And one of the things that was interesting out of the Affordable Care Act, where they are experimenting with different ways of paying people and seeing what the different incentives result. But the same thing in incarceration. If you pay people for bodies, you sit there and say, hey, as many people as you have, we'll pay you for. You're going to get a certain outcome. You're going to get a certain outcome that's based on, hey, let's make sure that there's as many people who get incarcerated as possible, which is going to create a dynamic where lobbying will push for more crime, for harsher punishment, and also a situation where basically you're going to try to spend as little as possible and create as low a quality of life for your inmates as possible. Basically, you pack them in like sardines. But changing that doesn't necessarily mean you shift it. You shift right back to the public sector, because the public sector's incentives aren't all that different, because they also have similar resource constraints, and also their own inefficiencies as well. You could think about thinking about what should be a crime, so that way you have less people within the system, okay, and then but also moving away from a system where basically you reward lobbying for more crime, and that could be that. There's different ways you can think about that. What if you paid people based on recidivism? Okay, basically, you come up with a certain level of dynamics, like certain metrics, like how many people got jobs after they got released, how many people came back, and basically, if all these metrics do well, you make a certain amount on a certain scale. Now, that's a hard thing to do. Necessarily, it has to be designed, it has to be piloted and practiced, but that's probably a direction where you'll create a link between how you make money versus results that we probably would like. So there's all of these different things. And then there's also bail reform, where basically, again, you have a situation where, depending on how bail is set, it could lead to more likely, again, poor people ending up in jail versus others. And there's also just the whole disparity of wealth within the justice system, in the sense that if you are wealthy, you can afford lawyers. You are more likely to be able to defend yourself. And this is not necessarily get away free. A lot of times you're just defending yourself. But you're able to defend yourself, which means if you won, you're going to have less likely get punished. And then if you're poor, where you're less likely to defend yourself, you're more likely to get punished, which is kind of unfair on a lot of levels. Which is another issue in the justice system. And that's an issue that's harder to fix. But that's why you don't necessarily want to call things that shouldn't be crimes, and all these other incentives that we've talked about, because you want to minimize that as possible. You're not going to get perfect. But also, not only that, it creates an incentive to overly punish people who are poor, because if your career is going to be based, your advancement in your career is going to be based on how much results you get for, whether it's convictions, arrests, cases closed, whatever, you're going to do it to people who you can more likely succeed in doing so, and that's going to generally skew towards a lower socioeconomic class, because that's just the way the math works. So there's all these issues with the criminal justice system, and that's the discussion we need to have, because this shapes the culture around us, which will shape the results around us. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.